Hello. We have been churning away through the cardiovascular system. We started with the respiratory system and looked at how gas exchange takes place in the lungs, how air passes through all these structures on its way. Then we turned our attention to the circulatory system. We focused on the heart, all the chambers, the blood vessels going in and out of the heart, and then the valves. And then we looked at the blood vessels. We looked at the difference between the arteries and the veins and the capillaries. And then we took a little time to just kind of learn the names of some of the major blood vessels. And I hope you noticed that a lot of those names follow the same pattern as the bones. So the radial artery is in line with the radius. The iliac artery is in line with the ilium in the hips. The subclavian is beneath the clavicle, subclavian. Um, Femoral vein, etc. So though that list may seem daunting at first, hopefully once you kind of dive in, you realize, this isn't too bad. Here's a little diagram. You're going to see this in the homework Schoology quiz as well, but you may want to take a moment to try and answer these questions and see how you do, and then see if you can list and explain one difference between arteries and veins. I'll just let you kind of self-assess on that. Today, our focus is on the final component of the circulatory system, which is blood. Now, as you may know, blood has several components, and if you think about what blood actually is, it consists of red blood cells, white blood cells, and these little cell fragments called platelets, all embedded in what's called plasma, this kind of liquidy material. And so I really like this picture because it kind of shows how messy blood is. It's just filled with all these different cells. It's this liquid with a bunch of cells dissolved into it. And so, when you get a cut, like that's kind of what's coming out of you, all these different types of cells. Um, if you were to take that blood, actually, let me back up, and put it in a centrifuge. So a centrifuge is a device that spins something really quickly. So you kind of put the blood in at an angle and you spin it really, really fast. And what happens is centrifugal force kind of pushes all the heavy stuff towards the outside. It's kind of like if you're on a ride at an amusement park and it's spinning around, you kind of feel yourself getting pushed against the wall. If you do that, all the big stuff, these red blood cells, these white blood cells, even the platelets kind of get packed to the bottom. And what you're left with on top is the plasma. So the plasma is the first component of blood I want to talk about, and this is the liquid component of blood. And it basically contains a lot of dissolved molecules. So it's got carbon dioxide, it's got hormones in there, it's got a bunch of different proteins. Um, Interestingly, there's antibodies in there. And so one of the questions with the COVID-19 pandemic is it possible that people who have had the disease and have survived, is it possible they have antibodies in their plasma? And could their plasma be used to treat other people? If you inject my plasma, if I've recovered from COVID-19 and you inject that into somebody who is suffering from the disease, could that actually help fight off the disease and save that person? So that's something that people are actively investigating right now, which is kind of interesting. Um, Another component of blood are the erythrocytes, and erythrocytes is a fancy word for the red blood cells. Red blood cells have basically one job, and that is they use a protein called hemoglobin to transport oxygen. Now, I want to just point out there are 4 to 6 million of these per cubic millimeter of blood. So think of the little tiny markings on a ruler. Um, one of those cubed, there's 4 to 6 million red blood cells. These are teeny tiny little things, and all they do is carry oxygen throughout the bloodstream. And the way they do that is with this protein right here called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin has 4 what are called heme groups, and in the middle of each heme group, kind of represented by that red dot, is iron. And what happens is an oxygen molecule is able to bind to each of these 4 heme groups. So every molecule of hemoglobin carries 4 molecules of oxygen. And so obviously the red blood cells are loaded with this hemoglobin protein and therefore can carry lots and lots of oxygen. Couple cool things about hemoglobin. First, what color is blood? Well, you're probably going to say red because if you get a cut and blood comes out, it's red. And the reason it's red is actually because of those red blood cells. You may have noticed when I showed you this picture back here, the plasma part is yellow. So the liquidy part of your blood is yellow. It's the red blood cells that kind of give it that red color. Um, but it turns out that the color depends on whether oxygen is attached to hemoglobin or not. If oxygen is attached, then you get that bright red color that we're all familiar with. If it's not, it's more of a kind of a maroon or kind of a dull red. If you've ever donated blood, you may notice that the blood is kind of a darker brick red color. Um, versus when you get a cut. Because when you get a cut, oxygen from the atmosphere immediately binds to the hemoglobin and turns it that bright red. But obviously, they don't want blood donations exposed to air, and so it's taken out of veins, which is oxygen poor blood, and then kept free of oxygen. So it's that kind of brick red. Another cool thing, how does carbon monoxide kill us? Well, carbon monoxide is a colorless, odorless gas. It can be produced as a waste product of your furnaces and things like that. Cars produce carbon monoxide, and so there's systems in place to kind of exhaust that stuff outside your house and make sure it doesn't kill you. Um, if there is something wrong with your furnace, like a leak of some kind, then that carbon monoxide might start to build up in a basement. And what happens is the person who has this carbon monoxide poisoning, they basically get tired and they get more tired and then they fall asleep and they never wake up. And it's kind of freaky because, again, it's odorless, it's colorless, so there's no indication that this is building up. That's why you have carbon monoxide detectors, hopefully, in your basement so that they can detect that. This is also why they tell you don't let your car running in a closed garage because if you do, then that carbon monoxide can build up and become dangerous. The way it actually kills us, though, it turns out that carbon monoxide has a very similar chemical structure to oxygen. If you're a chem guru, you could draw a quick Lewis dot structure of carbon monoxide, CO, and O2, and they're very, very similar to one another. And it turns out that carbon monoxide binds to and attaches to hemoglobin more tightly than oxygen. So basically, it crowds out the oxygen so that hemoglobin can't carry oxygen anymore, and you can't get any oxygen throughout your body. And that's why you get tired and eventually die. It's because you don't have enough oxygen. Um, oh, here are those Lewis dot structures. There you go. Forgot I had those. So you can see they're very, very similar. Um, finally, anemia. You've probably heard of anemia. And anemia, what happens is the person's tired a lot, and their blood is it's a little more runny than it's supposed to be. And what's happening is the someone who's anemic doesn't have enough red blood cells. And so if they don't have as many red blood cells, then if their blood is removed, it's just not quite as thick as good healthy blood. That's kind of gross to think about, as good healthy blood is supposed to be. And so what happens a lot of times, there's many types of anemia, but one of the more common ones is iron deficiency. So remember, iron is needed to produce hemoglobin. So if you don't get enough iron in your diet, you can't produce hemoglobin. If you can't produce hemoglobin, you can't produce red blood cells, and then you don't have as many red blood cells as you should. And without adequate red blood cells, you're going to be tired and yeah, tired all the time. And so the treatment for this type of anemia is quite simple: get iron. And this is actually fairly common. Women are more likely to suffer this than men because menstruation means they're losing blood more often and have to therefore produce more red blood cells. But it's actually also common in people who decide to sort of go on a vegetarian diet without thinking through how they're going to get all their nutrients. So while it's very possible and healthy actually to have a vegetarian diet, it turns out that iron is one of those things that's a little bit trickier to get from plant sources. If you eat a hamburger or a piece of meat, you're good for iron. But it's a little bit more tricky to get from plant materials, and it requires some intentionality to make sure you're getting enough. And so if somebody's just like, I'm going to be a vegetarian today and just kind of stops eating meat, but doesn't think through where am I going to make sure I get my iron, then sometimes they might become a little bit more anemic. So that's something to think about if you do decide to become a vegetarian, which, by the way, is a very healthy life choice and good for the environment. So go for it. Okay, third component of blood. We've talked about plasma. We've talked about erythrocytes, which are the red blood cells. The next ones are the leukocytes, or the white blood cells. Their job is to fight infections. And in bio, I believe you talked about all sorts of things related to the immune system: macrophages, helper T cells, cytotoxic T cells, B cells. All of those things are examples of leukocytes. We could spend days talking about the immune system. It's very complex. There's a lot going on there, but we just don't have time in a semester course to get to that. So know that those white blood cells are important for fighting infection. Finally, platelets. Platelets are, they're actually little cell fragments. And basically, they're just kind of these little sticky, they're little sticky things that kind of float around in your blood. And if you get a cut, like here's a damaged blood vessel, and you can see blood is coming out, the platelets just kind of stick to the ends there and start to clump up. And once they clump up, it can form kind of a preliminary blockage to that gap. And then that initiates the healing process. There's actually a number of proteins that make these kind of thread-like um, uh, mesh work of pattern over that wound. This is actually a red blood cell caught in that meshwork of proteins and platelets during wound healing. It's extraordinarily complicated, but platelets are a big part of stopping the bleeding after a cut. Okay, I think I'm going to pause there, and then we'll pick up with blood pressure in part 2.